well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm not sure that it's the Parliament's perspective that I'm going to be talking about, but mine anyway. And what I want to do, and I will come back to the issues which are on the table, is to take several steps back and to try and understand what are the processes by which the Russia that we have today came into being. And in a way, what we have to look at is what kind of society did the Soviet experiment, if I dare call it that, create? Obviously, it very largely resolved the peasant problem. Those of you who have background in sociology will know what I mean, that the historical peasantry was converted into something else. In Western Europe, the historical peasantry was converted very largely into citizens. Central Europe is another story, we can talk about this. What came into being in Russia was a manual working class, heavily dependent on the state, and a sizable white-collar stratum, again heavily dependent on the state. Russia became the lingua franca, and there was universal literacy. It seems to me I would put these at the top of the agenda. What the Soviet system didn't create, and actually it was not about creating such a thing, is a society with any strong civic sense. Individuals with autonomy and agency. And I would stress those two, both autonomy and agency. In other words, what we're looking at is a state-dependent society. It's very different from Western Europe, some analogies with Central Europe or Southeastern Europe. And it seems to me that for a large part of society, there continues to be suspicion of non-state directed activity. It is seen as improper culturally. And by the same token, what we also have is the Russian deep state. Those of you who follow Turkey will know this expression. It does what it wants to and not what the politicians tell it to, let alone the fledgling civil society that is emerging into being. Now, it seems to me that the role of civil society, from where I'm looking at it from my perspective, is to begin by taking the sociology of Russia seriously. In other words, don't start out with Western models and expect a vibrant civil society to come into being overnight. It's slow work. If you look at what we've been having in Central Europe, whichever country you look at, it's been very slow work. It's taken 20 years to get anywhere. And we're nowhere near having this kind of ideal, typical civil society, democracy and so on. It's getting there, and obviously different speeds in different places. And don't forget, the Soviet system has much deeper roots in Russia than it did in Central Europe. So that contrast, I think, is an important one to recognize. So take the sociology seriously, but crucially, see that there is change. And it seems to me that one of the most important changes, obviously the collapse of communism, the end of Marxism, Leninism, and all that. I mean, I think we can take that as read. But more importantly, the change of generations. I think the new generations are no longer, especially the educated generations, and that's quite a sizable segment of society, are no longer quite as state-dependent as their parents and grandparents were. And I think that's an important feature of the changing situation. So what one has to do, I would suggest, I don't want to offer lessons, but looking at the experience of other states, is organize from below, create a culture of trust. It's very difficult to do. It's very difficult to do it indeed. Crucially, trust in the public sphere. Trust in the private sphere is much easier. But trust in the public sphere means that you actually have to accept that people like yourself have fairly similar views, and they're not going to stab you in the back the moment you turn your back to them. So there's social activity as well as political activity. In some respects, social activity should actually precede political activity. Economic activity is something else again. It may or may not create trust, and I'm not so sure that in the Russian context it does it very much. I would suggest that, again, you may want to target semi-political, non-political areas like the demographic situation. I mean, those of you who follow will know that Russia's demography is in free fall. It's an unbelievable catastrophe, the rapid decline of population, the mortality, adult males die, I think it's 57 or something like this. I mean, it's unbelievable. I think infant mortality has been creeping up. These are appalling. Public health is clearly at the heart of this, and I suspect, from what little I read about this, public health issues in Russia are in a terrible state. You could buy yourself out of this if you have the money. But I think the average public health situation, there are probably epidemiological issues as well. Here it seems to me that civil society could do things. The environment. I don't think I need to go into great detail on this. Probably more difficult, but I have a shrewd suspicion that local government in certain circumstances can be targeted to improve things. Issues of this kind. It's low-level stuff. It's not spectacular. It will not attract the attention of Western journalists, but that's not the point at issue. I think it will attract the attention of those of us in the West who are following these things. I would also add here that Russian civil society, the one that's coming into being, has to accept that about 15% of the population of Russia is not Russian. And I think that this should be regarded as a resource, not some kind of a disloyalty trap or something of this kind. Different cultures can provide alternatives, different approaches to problems. Difference is not in itself disloyalty. And when you treat it as disloyalty, you employ violence, and then we're looking at the tragedy of the Northern Caucasus. It didn't have to go that way. If you look at the history of what has happened there in the last 10, 15 years, there's been a steady radicalization with the ever greater force which the center has tried to cope with this problem, Islamic radicalism, which, by the way, feeds into, in my view, but I have no proof of this, just a guess on my part, why Russia is so cautious over Syria. Because I think it has an Islamic radicalism problem of its own. This may even spread to the great urban centers in Russia itself, in the Russian heartland, where there's a sizable number of Muslim migrants from Central Asia. We will see. I think that immigrant group has to be treated with great care. Finally, EU and Russia. Now, here I think we're looking at the dilemma of different systems of power with different cultural norms, different expectations. I'm not saying the differences are enormous, but there are differences. And when these different systems with different cultural foundations meet, you always get a difficult interface. There is bound to be friction and misunderstanding, misdirection, and all sorts of other misses that you may want to add to my list. I think, very broad terms, the European Union is looking towards transformativity. The European Union does have an agenda. It wants to make the rest of the world like the European Union. It's never going to happen, by the way. But the entire agenda of human rights, gender mainstreaming, democracy, and all that, that's, in this sense, a neocolonial project. It's attempting to impose European norms on the rest of the world. Russia will not be like that. Russia, because it's got the critical mass and the history, the traditions, will generate its own model of modernity, its own idea of what it means to be modern. It will be different from ours. China, likewise, and by the way, so will the BRICS. I mean, Europe is losing. It has lost its battle. But that's really another conference, Fraser. So it seems to me that what I think the European Union can do is obviously trade, etc., the energy problem, the energy dependence, and so on. That is, I think, clear, and no one's going to disagree with that. What I think Europe can do is to try and help those in Russia who want to change in the direction that we like, keep their options open, to help where it's actually genuinely helpful, not to, support the oligarchs where the oligarchs are really doing dubious things and so on. And finally, on modernizing Russia. Now, I'm very careful with this term because modernization implies a single global modernity. Well, if you look at the world, there are many modernities. And it's one of these European deviations, the Western deviations, to think that there's a single modernity. Look at the differences between American modernity and German modernity. Very different in so many ways. And I think Russian modernity, which is sort of already there, bear in mind that Russia has gone through a failed modernization, which was called communism. The rethinking of Russian modernity will be hard and long, and I do not think that they should follow the European model in all respects, because that will just lead into a swamp. Thank you.
Thanks, George. That was